The longships appeared on the horizon like harbingers of doom, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning mist. But for the wives and daughters of defeated warriors, the sight of those black sails meant something far worse than death itself. What awaited them wasn't the quick end of a sword, but a fate so horrific that many would beg for the mercy of execution. This is the story that historians have deliberately buried for over 1,000 years, the systematic brutalization of women that went far beyond simple conquest. What the Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors wasn't just warfare, it was a calculated campaign of psychological and physical destruction designed to break not just bodies but souls. Today, we're uncovering the darkest secrets of Viking raids, where victory meant more than just plunder and territory. For the women who survived the initial slaughter, their nightmare was just beginning. What you're about to hear will forever change how you view the Viking Age and reveal why some fates truly are worse than death. From the systematic psychological torture that preceded physical brutality to the elaborate rituals of humiliation that destroyed entire bloodlines, we'll explore how an entire civilization turned the subjugation of women into both an art form and a weapon of war. Before we descend into this dark chapter of medieval history, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the forbidden secrets of the past. Now, prepare yourself for a story that reveals the true cost of Viking conquest, paid not by warriors on the battlefield, but by the innocent women they left behind. The Viking raids of the 8th through 11th centuries weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned military operations with specific objectives that went far beyond simple plunder. While popular culture focuses on the warriors and their battles, the true horror of Viking conquest lay in what happened after the fighting ended. When Viking longships struck coastal settlements, their attacks followed a calculated pattern designed to maximize both destruction and human capture. The raids typically began at dawn, when most villages were still asleep and defenses were at their weakest. But the Vikings weren't just seeking gold and silver, they were hunting for something far more valuable. The systematic targeting of women wasn't accidental or opportunistic. It was a deliberate strategy that served multiple purposes in Viking society. Women represented not just potential slaves, but symbols of conquest, tools of psychological warfare, and instruments for the complete destruction of enemy communities. The fate that awaited the wives of defeated warriors was determined by a complex hierarchy of brutalization that the Vikings had perfected over centuries of raiding. This wasn't random violence, but a sophisticated system of degradation that served specific cultural and strategic purposes within Norse society. The initial capture was designed to be as traumatic as possible. Women were often forced to watch the execution of their husbands and sons before being taken captive themselves. This psychological torture served to break their spirit before the physical abuse even began, ensuring compliance through absolute despair. The journey back to Scandinavia was itself a nightmare that many captives didn't survive. Packed into the holds of longships like cargo, women were chained together in spaces barely large enough for them to lie down. The voyages could last weeks, during which time captives received minimal food and water while being subjected to constant abuse from their captors. But the true horror began when they reached Viking settlements. The fate of captured women was determined by their age, appearance, and the status of their defeated husbands. Those married to important warriors faced the most elaborate and prolonged forms of humiliation, as their suffering served to demonstrate the completeness of Viking victory. The concept of thraldom in Viking society went far beyond simple slavery. For the wives of defeated warriors, it represented a systematic destruction of identity that was designed to erase not just their freedom, but their very sense of self. They were stripped of their names, their cultural identity, and any connection to their former lives. The psychological warfare employed by the Vikings was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Captured women were forced to participate in rituals that violated their religious beliefs, compelled to serve in ceremonies that mocked their dead husbands, and made to witness the destruction of everything they had once held sacred. The breeding programs implemented by Viking captors were particularly horrific. Women were treated like livestock, forced to reproduce to create more slaves for their masters. Children born into this system had no knowledge of their mother's origins and were raised to believe that servitude was their natural state. The legal framework of Viking society offered no protection for these women. They were considered property, not people, and could be bought, sold, traded, or killed at their owner's whim without any legal consequences whatsoever. This legal dehumanization created an environment where the most horrific abuses could occur without fear of punishment. The daily existence of these women was a constant cycle of labor and abuse. They were forced to work in fields, tend livestock, cook meals, and perform any other tasks their masters demanded. But their suffering extended far beyond mere physical labor. They were also expected to provide sexual services to their owners and any guests the owners wished to honor. The religious violations were particularly traumatic for Christian women captured during Viking raids. They were forced to participate in pagan rituals, sometimes as sacrificial offerings themselves. The spiritual violation was as traumatic as the physical abuse, stripping away their connection to their faith and their former identity. The social hierarchy among captives created additional layers of suffering. Women who had been wives of important warriors were often singled out for special humiliation, forced to serve those who had been their social inferiors in their former lives. This deliberate inversion of social order was designed to maximize psychological trauma. The Viking practice of wife-sharing among warriors represented one of the most degrading aspects of captivity. Women were passed between different owners, never allowed to form attachments or find any sense of security. This constant uncertainty and abuse was designed to prevent any possibility of resistance or escape. The impact on children born to these women was devastating and deliberate. Viking captors used specific techniques to ensure that children would never identify with their mother's original culture. They were deliberately separated from their mothers at young ages and raised to view their enslaved parents with contempt. The economic value of these women was so high that entire Viking expeditions were organized specifically to capture them. The slave markets of Dublin, York, and Kiev became major economic centers where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, with women from defeated warrior families commanding the highest prices. The psychological techniques used to break these women were sophisticated and systematic. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, and constant humiliation designed to destroy their will to resist. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe trauma disorders that made them compliant and broken. The seasonal nature of Viking raids meant that the suffering of these women followed predictable patterns. Spring raids would bring fresh captives who would be broken in during the summer months, while winter provided time for the systematic abuse that ensured long-term compliance. The religious justification for these practices was carefully constructed by Viking priests and skalds. The suffering of enemy women was presented as offerings to the gods, with their degradation serving to ensure divine favor for future raids. This religious framework allowed Vikings to view even the most brutal abuse as spiritually necessary. The impact on Viking society itself was profound and lasting. The normalization of extreme violence against women created a culture where brutality was not just accepted, but celebrated. Children grew up believing that the systematic abuse of captives was not just normal, but virtuous. The archaeological evidence from Viking settlements paints a disturbing picture of how widespread and systematic this abuse was. Excavations have revealed specialized buildings for housing captives, restraining devices, and burial sites that suggest many women were killed and buried with their masters to serve them in the afterlife. The genetic legacy of Viking raids can still be traced in modern DNA studies. Populations across Scandinavia show clear evidence of ancestry from the British Isles, Ireland, and other regions that were frequent targets of Viking attacks. These genetic markers tell the story of thousands of women who were torn from their homes and forced to bear children in foreign lands. The psychological trauma inflicted on these women was so severe that it affected not just the immediate victims, but their descendants for generations. Children born into slavery often suffered from what we would now recognize as complex trauma disorders, passed down through families that had been torn apart by violence. The methods used to prevent escape were as cruel as they were effective. Women were often deliberately injured in ways that would make flight impossible, while psychological conditioning ensured that even those physically capable of escape were too broken to attempt it. The seasonal festivals of Viking society often featured the ritualized abuse of captive women as entertainment. These public displays served multiple purposes. They provided amusement for the community, demonstrated the power of successful raiders, and served as warnings to any who might consider resistance. The trading networks that developed around the slave trade in women were vast and sophisticated. Professional traders established routes that connected Scandinavia with markets across Europe and beyond, creating an international network of human trafficking that spanned continents. The decline of these practices came not from moral awakening but from practical changes in Viking society. As the Vikings began to settle and establish permanent kingdoms, the need for constant raiding decreased, and with it, the systematic capture and abuse of women from defeated communities. The conversion to Christianity provided a moral framework that eventually condemned these practices, but this religious transformation took centuries to have any real impact. Even after official conversion, many of the attitudes and practices that had enabled the systematic abuse of women persisted in modified forms. The legacy of Viking treatment of captive women serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to maximize human suffering for strategic and economic gain. The deliberate erasure of these stories from popular historical narratives reflects our discomfort with confronting the full horror of what our ancestors endured and inflicted. The romanticized image of Vikings as noble warriors obscures the reality that they were also systematic practitioners of human trafficking and sexual violence on an industrial scale. Modern archaeological and genetic evidence continues to reveal the true scope of Viking impact on the women of medieval Europe. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how systematic the abuse was and how lasting its effects proved to be. The psychological techniques developed by the Vikings for breaking the spirits of captive women were so effective that they influenced practices of subjugation for centuries afterward. The methods they pioneered for destroying identity and resistance became templates for later systems of oppression. The economic impact of the Viking slave trade in women was enormous, funding further raids and supporting entire communities built on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. The wealth generated by this trade helped finance the expansion of Viking influence across Europe and beyond. The social structures that enabled these practices reveal important insights into how entire societies can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves their economic and strategic interests. The Vikings weren't monsters. They were people who had created a culture that rewarded the systematic abuse of others. The resistance shown by some captive women, despite the overwhelming odds against them, provides important examples of human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. Their stories, though largely lost to history, remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure. The long-term impact of Viking practices on European society was profound and lasting. The trauma inflicted on entire communities created cycles of violence and mistrust that influenced political and social development for generations. As we examine these dark chapters of history, we must confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the capacity for cruelty that exists within all societies. The Vikings' treatment of captive women reminds us that civilization is a fragile construct that can quickly dissolve when power is unchecked and cruelty is rewarded. The women who suffered under Viking captivity deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings whose lives had value and meaning beyond their utility to their captors. Their stories, though painful to hear, are an essential part of understanding the true cost of historical violence. The systematic nature of Viking abuse reveals how quickly societies can develop sophisticated methods of dehumanization when it serves their interests. The techniques they used to break the spirits of captive women were not the products of individual sadism, but of cultural systems that had evolved to maximize the extraction of value from human suffering. Today, as we study these historical horrors, we honor the memory of those who suffered by ensuring that their stories are told and their experiences acknowledged. The wives of defeated warriors who faced fates worse than death deserve to have their suffering recognized as part of the historical record. The legacy of Viking treatment of women serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which societies can slip into systematic cruelty. By understanding these dark chapters of our past, we can better recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about the scope and systematic nature of Viking abuse of captive women. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how widespread these practices were and how deeply they were embedded in Viking culture and society. The genetic legacy of these practices can still be traced in modern populations, serving as a permanent reminder of the human cost of Viking expansion. The DNA of millions of people today carries the evidence of ancestors who were torn from their homes and forced into lives of servitude and abuse. As we conclude this examination of one of history's darkest chapters, we must remember that behind every statistic was a real person, a wife torn from her family, a mother separated from her children, a woman whose life was destroyed by forces beyond her control. Their stories deserve to be told, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to honor their memory and ensure that such horrors are never forgotten or repeated.